For most people, the First World War is associated with mud and the trenches and Flanders. It's about the image that we have on Blackadder or from reading the war poets. But there is a very different narrative of this conflict, how it influenced ordinary people's lives, how it was fought in the fields, factories and the kitchens of people across the country. For the last 4 years we've been exploring ways in which ordinary people's lives in Worcestershire and the surrounding counties have been shaped by this conflict.
On the 4th of August 1914, war was declared, and Britain faced a critically important question: how could it feed itself? For the previous century, Britain had become increasingly dependent on plentiful and inexpensive food imported from around the globe, and by 1914, about 80% of the country's grain came from the USA, and 2/3 of its sugar came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, on whom we had just declared war. So Britain had to find ways of feeding both her fighting men and those on the home front.
In Worcestershire and the rest of Britain, food became a weapon of war. It had to be stretched further, waste had to be cut, and productivity at home had to be increased. These were all tasks that fell to women. And as the war progressed, and pleas for voluntary restraint on consumption proved insufficient, government controls, subsidies, and eventually rationing increased.
The prospect of shortages caused panic buying. In the first week of the war, a letter written to a Worcester newspaper reported,
"If we cannot be a law unto ourselves, it is to be hoped that the government will deal quickly with this matter and allow a certain amount of food to be purchased by individuals."
The patriotic rush by men to join up left many families who already lived a hand-to-mouth existence facing outright poverty, a situation exacerbated by rising food prices and rents. Although wives and children were entitled to a separation allowance, it was administered by charities who often withheld payments from children born out of wedlock, or so-called unmarried wives.
Even when the allowance system was efficient, allowances barely covered one half of some families' expenditure.
And as the Worcester Herald reported, delays in payment had tragic consequences.
A mother of 5 promised to pay the landlord the arrears as soon as she received her separation allowance. This should have arrived, but there was some delay. In any case, it will arrive in the course of a post or two. When she got back home after a visit to the Guildhall, a notice to quit possession of the tenement had been left for her.
By 1915, the government was encouraging the public to eat less bread and talking about the kitchen as the key to victory. Families in town and country were exhorted to grow food and avoid any waste.
In towns, the allotment movement was encouraged using the Defence of the Realm Act, which allowed the authorities to take over land for allotments. Birmingham Parks Department received over 1,000 applications for plots, and by 1920 more than 1,600 acres of Birmingham land was given over to allotments. Many households, mostly rural but some urban ones too, kept a pig in a sty to provide bacon and ham for the family. Salting the pig became something of an annual ritual, but the slaughter, butchering and salting of a pig were physically onerous tasks that some wives would probably have struggled to complete unaided. The pig was so significant to the economic survival of the households that clubs were set up providing a sort of insurance for families who were able to be financially compensated if their pig became ill or died.
By 1916, food stocks were low, but a poor wheat harvest and a failure of the potato crop in Scotland and England created food shortages, and according to the Board of Trade's figures, by July 1916, food prices had increased 61% since the outbreak of war.
When the people of Worcester received a gift of 800 sacks of potatoes from Canada, it was such an important event it was reported in a local paper.
There was a continuous procession of women, armed with bags and baskets, and tickets which entitled them to have these filled. Each one received 15 pounds of potatoes and went away with a radiant face and well-filled basket.
German families were also suffering profound hardships. The British naval blockade and poor autumn weather caused a famine, with many of the population having to subsist on turnips. On the 19th of January 1917, the High Command responded by declaring unrestricted U-boat warfare. The effects were dramatic. More than 500 merchant ships were sunk in less than 12 weeks. In April alone, 869,000 tons of shipping was sunk, taking its cargo of food to the bottom of the sea. The nation's stock of sugar was only enough to last for 4 days. Responding, the government launched a voluntary rationing scheme, suggesting a weekly allowance of 4 pounds of bread, 2.5 pounds of meat, and 3/4 pound of sugar.
The main focus of advice and encouragement from the authorities was on reducing the consumption of grain. The Win the War cookery book promised, yes, complete victory if you eat less bread, and inside it suggested that every well-cooked meal that saves bread and wastes no food is a victory. A message from the King, read out in all churches on the 29th of May, extolled everyone to practice the greatest economy and frugality in the use of every species of grain. Readers were encouraged to chew their food for longer or to masticate more, as this was not only better for the digestion, but supposedly made people feel fuller after eating. Kidderminster was particularly concerned about bread consumption, campaigning through posters, exhibitions and demonstrations, with repeatedly reminding housewives of the fines that would be imposed for wasting bread, and that the cupboard is the housewife's trench and she must defend it.
Despite these efforts, the price and consumption of bread were higher in 1917 than in pre-war years, and as a result of concerns about the social consequences of increasing prices, a bread subsidy was introduced in September 1917, and mills put under government control.
A bread order was introduced which prohibited the sale of freshly baked bread. All loaves had to be at least 12 hours old, as it was believed that if it's a bit stale it was more difficult to slice and less appetising.
In a further initiative, national kitchens were launched. Locally administered, but with government funding, they offered takeaway or restaurant meals.
They provided a nutritious meal and plenty of veg for a bargain price. Coupons had to be exchanged for the meat, but there were some attempts at providing offal coupon-free. At the height of their popularity, there were 363 kitchens in the country, and in the spirit of egalitarianism, they were open to everyone. Birmingham, which opened their kitchen in 1918, had one central kitchen and 7 subsidiary ones, serving 2,500 portions a day. The largest kitchen seated 72 people.
But all these efforts failed to address the social inequalities of the availability of food. The well-off relied on their servants to queue for food and could afford the higher prices. But for the poor, problems were increasing. Food control committees were set up to restrict prices, but shortages became more severe, and newspapers reported queues of 600 people waiting for 6 hours to obtain half a pound of margarine in Worcester. Concerned by the prospect of social unrest at a critical time in the war, the government introduced sugar rationing in January 1918 and began to put in place a system of rationing for meat, butter, cheese and margarine.
By April, everyone, including the King and Queen, had an allowance which provided approximately 16 ounces of meat and 4 to 8 ounces of bacon, 4 ounces of butter or margarine, 2 ounces of lard, 1.5 ounces of tea and 8 ounces of sugar per week. Rationing seems to have been grudgingly accepted and seen to be fair. Long food queues and the use of national kitchens declined and prices began to stabilise. Rationing had its most significant effect on the diets of the wealthy, and a record in the scrapbook kept at Hagley Hall noted that it was very difficult to get food, frequently no butter, margarine and lard. Everyone looks very thin, as if a good leg of mutton would do them good. Despite much initial hardship, government actions such as the introduction of rationing and national kitchens did much to ensure that the health of most working class families had not suffered any long-term consequences from the wartime shortages.